Hello everyone. Today I'd like to take a look at a video from a YouTuber by the name of Roman Millennial entitled People of Colour, You Are Not Oppressed. And wouldn't that be nice? That's right, new subscribers from the Cuphead video. I usually talk about politics and history and all that boring stuff. I feel the need to apologise here. Okay, so for everyone else who is still with us, who is Roman Millennial? Well, she's one of the YouTubers in the I'm not a racist, but vein, so she's not a racist, okay, acknowledged she's not a racist, but she's got a few questions, So I'm going to do my good deed for the day here and provide the answers to those questions. Just one YouTuber helping another YouTuber out. So what is Roaming Millennial's video about? Well, I would encourage you to watch the whole thing, and I'll put a link in the description, but I'll show a couple of short clips here just to get us started off.
So in this video, in the hopes of healing this headache of imaginary oppression that is going around the social justice sphere, we're going to be talking all about oppression, what it means to be oppressed, and how in the United States and in the rest of the Western world, no, people of color, you are not oppressed. So to start, let's go over the definition of oppression. And yes, I know this is super basic, but after hearing those students protest, I really do feel that cracking a dictionary open is necessary. So the definition of oppression is really quite simply prolonged cruel or unjust treatment or control. Now with this definition, I think it is perfectly clear to say that in the past, people of color, and more specifically African American people, were oppressed by societies in the United States and the West in general. I'm not going to argue against that. However, the issue here is that these evergreen students and so many social justice warriors out there are not just arguing for the idea of past oppression, but for current and ongoing oppression. And really, that is just a completely inaccurate analysis of the world that we live in. Obviously, in the United States, there are no legal rights that a white person possesses that a non-white person does not, and there are no laws on the books that reference an individual's race in any way, right? I mean, our legal system, our entire system of government is not one that is racially coded.
Okay, so here's the main thrust of Roaming Millennial's argument. Oppression may have happened in the past, and that's good, she concedes that much at least. But today we have legal equality, so that means oppression is not happening at all. Now the first mistake she's made here is a rather basic one, and it's one you see a lot online. Roaming Millennial is only considering legality. She showed the dictionary definition of oppression, prolonged cruel or unjust treatment or control, but appears to have misread it. Legal rights are not mentioned here. Oppression can still happen even within a legal system that is on paper completely equal and just, because the system isn't perfect, of course. It's made up of individuals all with their own beliefs and biases, and the sum of those beliefs and biases can add up to a system that appears fair on the surface, but delivers unfair results. But we'll loop back around to this in a second. For now, let's watch the next part of Roaming Millennial's argument where she attempts to address these unfair results.
And while, in my opinion, equal standing in the eyes of the law and equal standing before government is a pretty clear indication that oppression is not happening, some critics might say, no, what are you talking about? There's no equal standing. There are huge racial disparities when it comes to the legal system, especially the criminal justice system. Just look at how much more likely black people are to be incarcerated than Hispanic or white people. I mean, obviously that's the result of oppression. Okay, so to answer the question of oppression in relation to the criminal justice system, which comes up a lot, we first need to return to our definition of oppression. To repeat once more, oppression is prolonged cruel or unjust treatment or control. So what this definition means for our discussion here is that black people being more likely to be incarcerated is not evidence in and of itself to prove that they are oppressed. Oppression refers specifically to unjust treatment or unjust punishment. So for oppression to be happening, black people would need to be incarcerated unjustly at a higher rate than other races, right? Because it wouldn't be oppression if these people were being justly arrested and prosecuted for crimes that they actually did commit. So while many social justice activists try to paint the large black prison populations in the US as evidence of oppression, the fact is that black people are more likely to commit crimes than other races. So with this being the case, it is not unjust and therefore not oppressive for the racial makeup of prison populations to be representative of the racial makeup of people who commit crimes. The question here isn't, are there proportionately more black people in prison than white people, because obviously that's the case. The question is why? Is it because prejudice causes more black people than white people to be convicted of crimes that they did not commit? Or is it because on average a black person is more likely to commit a crime than a white person and therefore more likely to go to jail for what they've done? Statistics would indicate the latter.
Statistics would indicate the latter, apparently. Well, we'll see. Now then, Roaming Millennial makes several errors in this section. Some are errors of mathematics, some errors of omission, and a couple of contradictions of logic there too. I don't know where to start, really, to be honest. But how about we start with this statement of Roaming Millennials? For oppression to be happening, black people would need to be incarcerated unjustly. You see, her point here is that black people are more likely to commit crimes than other races, so it makes sense for them to be a larger percentage of the prison population. So first of all here, what she does not examine, possibly on purpose, is whether or not these percentages match up, because that's important. And I'll give you two scenarios here. So, scenario 1. Let's say one group of people are 10% more likely to commit crimes than other groups of people, and also make up 10% extra of the prison population. Now that's what you'd expect in a fair system, at least without factoring wider society into our little example here anyway. Now, scenario 2. One race of people are 10% more likely to commit crimes than other races, but make up 30% extra of the prison population. Now that's unfair and unjust treatment, even accounting for that hypothetical group's higher relative criminality. Do you understand? So returning to reality, which of our little scenarios there more accurately reflects the criminal justice system in the United States? Well, one way to answer this question is to look not at how certain groups are treated within the system, but how individuals belonging to those groups are treated. So let's do that. And here's a study from 2013 from the Yale Law Journal entitled Mandatory Sentencing and Racial Disparity, assessing the role of prosecutors and the effects of Booker. And I'd like to read you a few lines from their conclusion. We agree that the high rate of incarceration of black men is a serious social problem, and that examining the possible contribution of disparities in the criminal justice system is important. Our research suggests that in the federal system, disparities in the post-arrest justice process contribute to this problem. After controlling for the arrest offence, criminal history and other prior characteristics, sentences for black male arrestees diverge substantially from those of white male arrestees by about 10% on average. While this disparity does not seem to be growing, it is persistent. So, did you like that study? Because here's another. This is a United States Sentencing Commission report entitled Report on Continuing Impact of United States v. Booker on Federal Sentencing. And what did that find? The Commission's updated multivariate regression analysis showed, among other outcomes, that black male offenders have continued to receive longer sentences than similarly situated white male offenders. And how much longer were their sentences? This is from later in the report. For example, sentence length for black male offenders exceeded sentence length for white male offenders by 19.5%. And I should note here that I found both of these reports in an article responding to Roaming Millennial on pathos.com, which I will link in the description. So that's fairly clear cut there, I think. On an individual level, controlling for all the factors except race, black men still get longer sentences than white men. And because they get longer sentences than white men, they will on average be in prison for longer, and therefore at least some part of their overrepresentation in the prison system is accounted for by this unfair sentencing. Any argument for this to be fair that mentions black people's increased relative likelihood of being criminals would have to therefore argue that individual black people deserve longer individual sentences relative to other races. And this is without considering that the very metric we're using to declare black people's increased relative criminality is frequency of occurrence in the criminal justice system, which we've just proven is biased against them. And it's not just on the prosecution end that black people get screwed over. One fact I like to bring up here is that black people are several times more likely than white people to be arrested for marijuana possession, even though black people and white people smoke weed at similar rates. It's all well and good to have a fair and just system on paper, but that doesn't mean the system necessarily delivers fair and just results. For oppression to be happening, black people would need to be incarcerated unjustly, said Roaming Millennial, and she's correct. They are, so therefore it is, if you follow. So to move on here, Roaming Millennial there mentioned the black crime rate as justification for a relatively high incarceration rate compared with other races. And I'd like to ask a question here. What would Roaming Millennial argue is the cause of that higher crime rate? And there's only two answers, really. There's the genetic/racist argument, black people are inherently by birth more likely to be criminals. And there's the societal argument, the disparity is explained by a combination of cultural and socioeconomic factors alongside the aforementioned bias in the justice system. And as a little aside here, one annoying thing you tend to see online is someone who secretly favours the genetic argument but fears saying it out loud, so they just dismiss the societal factors one by one as being irrelevant without ever actually committing to the genetic argument. And that can be a little irksome. Anyway, which argument does Roaming Millennial put forward? And I'll read a couple of Twitter conversations here. Roaming Millennial says, minority communities on average have more crime than mixed or majority white communities. That leads to increased cop encounters. And a Twitter user called Flying Volvo says, really makes you think about what causes it, doesn't it? Almost like there's some underlying causes of crime in African American communities. To which Roaming Millennial responds, poverty and culture. So it appears here that Roaming Millennial favours the socio-economic argument. Poverty is linked with crime, after all, and increased poverty in predominantly African American areas would explain the disparity in the crime statistics. However, with regards to our oppression argument here, we necessarily have to consider the causes of that poverty. Because it's entirely possible that the poverty argument is simply the genetic argument again, but one step removed from what will get you banned off Twitter. If the poverty's causes are unexamined, an audience might assume that black people are genetically more likely to be in poverty due to possessing some inherent poverty-related characteristics, and therefore, by proxy, more likely to be criminals. Now, we know that Roaming Millennial has previously stated that oppression existed in the past. So the question here is, could that past oppression have contributed to creating the current poverty? So I guess we have to ask, how far in the past is Roaming Millennial talking when she says oppression existed? And returning to Twitter again, a Twitter user called Hip Hop is Knowledge said, my parents weren't even allowed to drink from water fountains in public, you dumb fuck. To which Roaming Millennial responds, no one's denying institutionalized racism/oppression existed in the past, literally no one, but that's not indicative of current policies. Now this exchange indicates that Roaming Millennial considers the Jim Crow laws that enforced racial segregation in the United States to be examples of institutionalized racism and oppression. Very good, I'm with her on that. Now these laws were in place until the mid-1960s. So from the Declaration of Independence up until roughly 50 years ago, according to Roaming Millennial, there was institutionalized racism and oppression in the United States. So accepting that, it would be very bizarre indeed to then go on to claim that such a long period of racism and oppression would have zero effects whatever on current society. If you enslave a given race of people and prevent education and break up families and confiscate all their belongings and deny them the vote, and then subject them to a post-slavery period where for generations they're forbidden by law from attending the best schools and all the other rights afforded the majority, all these things have lasting effects. Black people in poverty in the United States are in a poverty that was in part created by this history of oppression, and that's unfair and unjust, isn't it? And as a brief side note about culture here, which Roaming Millennial cites as another reason for the crime rate disparity, one particular culture is only one side of the coin. We also have to consider how that culture is perceived on the outside. Now, an individual black person might be subject to discrimination based on that perception, and any one average individual has a minimal effect on that culture as a whole. People can't always choose how they're perceived. You can criticize a culture as a whole, but you can't hand-wave away longer prison sentences for individual black people because of it. That's unfair and unjust. Let's take a look at another argument of Roaming Millennials now, the Asian American argument.
And something that I'd like to mention, which really debunks the idea that non-white people in the US are oppressed, is the fact that there are non-white groups out there who on average do better than their white counterparts in terms of education and finances. And yes, felony charges too.
So then, people of colour can't be oppressed because Asian Americans on average are better educated and have a higher average income than white Americans. Now, does this therefore prove that oppression is now a thing of the past and has no bearing at all on modern society? Well, I would argue quite the opposite. In fact, a larger percentage of Asian Americans being educated and having a higher average income stems directly from discrimination against Asian people. And stick with me now, it's kind of a counterintuitive one, this, I understand. How can discrimination against a group lead to them being, on average, better off down the line? And another question here before I answer that one. In the graph of average household incomes that Roaming Millennial showed, why doesn't the Asian data go back as far as the others? And these answers are linked, as you'll see. So I'm going to throw a few data points your way now, and we'll see if we can later draw some conclusions from them. So first of all, in 1960, the Asian population of the United States was less than 1 million. They comprised around half of 1% of the population. And this is compared to there being over 18 million black people in 1960, to give you a sense of the scale there. Today, there are around 20 million Asian Americans, so why were there so few, relatively, in 1960, and why are there comparatively so many more today? Point number 2. In 1882, the United States Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, prohibiting Chinese immigration into the United States and making the Chinese migrants present in the United States at the time permanent aliens by excluding them from the possibility of US citizenship. Point number 3. The Immigration Act of 1917, also known as the Asiatic Barred Zone Act, barred immigration from large parts of Asia completely. Point number 4. The Immigration Act of 1924, including the Asian Exclusion Act, but not to be confused with the Chinese Exclusion Act, imposed strict quotas on how many people of a particular nationality could be resident in the United States at the time, and barred completely everyone who was ineligible to become a United States citizen. Fifth, and finally here, the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, which removed the racial and national barriers that were previously in place, which restricted immigration from Asia. So then, why in 1960 were there a relatively small number of Asian people in the United States? And that's because immigration from Asia was massively restricted by a series of discriminatory laws. And then after those restrictions were lifted, immigration from Asia skyrocketed, relatively anyway. Now, the vast majority of Asian American population growth in recent decades has been due to immigration. So then, we need to ask, who can move to a different country? And primarily of importance to us here is people who can afford to move to a different country. And this is particularly true of a country very far away with which you do not share a land border. The average Chinese labourer cannot say, "Oh, I'm not feeling this really, I think I'll just move to America and buy a house and go to college." You see my point here. The United States is not seeing an accurate representative economic cross-section of people from those Asian countries that immigrants are arriving from. The immigrants are those that can afford to move and afford to pay for college, and this is reflected in the average income statistics. The disparity in average incomes present in the United States today is rooted in the history of these discriminatory laws. For a comparative example, imagine transplanting all the African Americans in the United States outside it, and then only allowing back in those that had the resources to make the move. And if you did that, the average household income for African Americans in the United States would increase dramatically. Not because they're actually any richer, remember, but simply because you'd be excluding all the poor people. I mean, poverty obviously still exists in Asia, doesn't it? Anyway, let's wrap up here. I feel like I've pitched enough answers to Roaming Millennial there for her to think about for one day. Now, this is a video I would actually like to see a response to. I want to know what Roaming Millennial or her fans think about what I've said and how they would answer me. I anticipate getting a fair amount of insults here, obviously, but I want to see arguments. If you think I'm wrong, try and prove me wrong. If you think the studies I referenced came to incorrect conclusions, prove it. The ball's in your court. I'm eager for responses here since I feel like the right are just chasing their tails on this issue, and I want to try and move the conversation on. Thanks a lot for watching, everyone. Do you have a particular video or topic you'd like me to take a look at? You can send me it over on Curious Cat, and I'll take a peek. I have enough projects to last for months here, but occasionally something will jump the queue if I think it's a particularly good fit for a video. Thanks, as always, to my supporters over on Patreon, who are not scrolling by right now. The credits finally got silly enough for me to drop them in the form they were in anyway, but don't worry, credits fans, tune in next time for the return of the credits.